We're on track with what the kids are learning. And as Natalie mentioned, they're going through a curriculum where they're going through the entire Bible, and they're going to finish that up the end of this month, or the end of May. I'm already jumping ahead to May. This whole 5-Sunday month messes me up. This entire month, I was thinking that this Sunday was May. I thought it was May 1st, and it was one of those things I was convinced in my mind, and I could not get that out of my head. So I'm still messed up on that. But anyway, the kids, they're going to finish going through the Bible, the entire Bible from Genesis to Revelation. That'll be the end of May, so we're going to do a celebration for them and celebrate that our kids have gone through the entire Bible. I think that's really cool. But we are keeping on pace with them. So we're on the same lesson as the kids. And this week they're talking about the priesthood of Jesus. And this is kind of an interesting one and a very important one. And of course it comes from the book of Hebrews. And kind of to set up the background to this, we have to understand that the Old Testament was a shadow of the things that were to come. And a lot of people make really cringeworthy statements like the Old Testament was done away with. We're New Testament Christians. We don't have anything to do with the Old Testament. I know Christians who don't read the Old Testament. They want nothing to do with it. And I think it's a really big mistake. And it's not a true statement that the Old Testament was done away with, that it was nailed to the cross, that we don't follow the Old Testament anymore because we're New Testament Christians. It's just that's not true. And if you think about the Bible that was used all throughout our New Testament, throughout that entire through all of the journeys, missionary journeys, through Jesus's reign on this earth, what were the scriptures that they were using? It was all the Old Testament. None of the New Testament was written. Not a single page of it was written. And so that was their Bible. When they went out and evangelized and preached and baptized people, they were using the Old Testament scriptures for all of it. So I think that's really important to remind us of that. And then the book of Hebrews is definitely written to a group of Jewish people. So it was written to Jewish Christians. I grew up believing that Paul wrote the book of Hebrews. It was attributed to Paul. There was no question about it. Turns out that that's not really factual. It's not proof. No, it's a theory. But there are a lot of other theories that, it definitely is an anonymous letter. Paul says that he wrote all of his letters. Paul signs his letters. Remember, he writes, "See what big letters I write with? This is my letter." He wrote that in Galatians. Paul signs his letters. Hebrews is an anonymous letter, so we don't really know who wrote Hebrews. But it is an authentic book. It's canonized, so it's part of the New Testament. It was used a lot in the first few centuries. It has legitimacy. There's nothing to indicate that this is not a valid book of the Bible. So I think that's important too. So I guess also as part of the background, what was the role of the priest? What did the priest do for people? When you have the priest in the Old Testament, what did they do? Yeah, for what? What specifically were they making sacrifices for? Yeah, it's an atonement for other people's sins. And you had kind of your different classification of sacrifices and the types of animals that you would bring, or food. There were food sacrifices. There were all kinds of different kinds of sacrifices. But the priest atoned for the sin for other people. And so a priest would make sacrifices how often? How often did you sin? Yeah, I mean, there were daily sacrifices. It's not like, you read about some sacrifices and you kind of get the feeling, well, once a year they would have these big sacrifices. No, sacrifices were made constantly, every day, which is why you get people like Eli in the Old Testament. What do we know about Eli, besides for his sons rebelling and, he keeled over dead? What does the Bible say about Eli that kind of stands out? Does anybody, or anything that stands out about Eli the priest? He was obese. He was a fatty McFat because the priest got to eat a lot of these sacrifices. There was a portion that was saved for the priest. And I get the feeling that there were not very many skinny priests. Because if you look at the prescriptions in the Old Testament for how much they were supposed to eat, they and their families, I don't think there were many priests that were slim and fit. Yeah, they had to take a portion of certain sacrifices. Yeah, so
they couldn't keep the hold on,
right? Yeah, they couldn't dish it out to other people. A certain portion had to be preserved for the priest and his family, and they had to consume it all. Whatever they didn't consume, they would have to burn up totally. They couldn't. It's not like they could take leftovers and give it to the homeless and starving people. They had to consume it all in the fire. So, yeah, I know. So priests, I think, were probably a lot like me. Where last night Natalie almost took a spoon and smacked my hand with it at dinner because she was like, finally, there's going to be a meal where there are leftovers and you're not touching them. She's like, you're not going to eat all of this food. Because I have a bad habit. If I see food on the table, I have it in my mind that it has to get consumed. I have to eat it. And I know, a lot of sin. That's right. So the point is that these sacrifices had to be made over and over and over and over again. And with Jesus, it was one sacrifice, one time, forever. And of course, we as Christians, we know because the things in the Old Testament were a shadow of the things to come that were fulfilled through Christ. Christ's sacrifice moves both backwards and forwards. So all these people, in Hebrews is pretty clear, it was impossible for these sacrifices to fully take away the sin of these people because they had to keep sacrificing over and over and over. And then you get into all the weird hypotheticals. Well, what if they die while they're sinning? And we've talked.
Sacrifices actually didn't forgive sin at all.
Yeah. It was,
the only reason that they did is the same as what we talked about. That they were obeying God.
Yeah.
But it was all. It says somewhere, and I'm assuming it's in Hebrews. I don't remember about
it can't take away. Yeah, it can't take away the sin of the people. That's right. Yeah.
Sacrifice of blood, bulls and goats can never take away the sin.
Yeah, that's right.
But rolling it forward, basically, something along those lines. I forget exactly.
Yeah. So that's why they're doing. Yeah.
He would remember the exact passage and be able to.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, his memory is much better than mine. But yeah, you're absolutely right. So it's an atoning, and so they had to go through purity rituals. They had to, and by the way, baptism by immersion was not a new thing at all in the New Testament. What was new was have someone else immerse you in a one-time immersion. Jewish people had, they were called mikvaot, which are like these purification baths. They were built all over the temple, and anybody that's visited Jerusalem, you can still see the mikvaot, which are, you have steps going down one side, steps coming, kind of like our baptistry, really. They're built into the ground, and then it would have a source of fresh water coming into it, so it had to have circulating water. It couldn't be water that was stagnated, that was sitting, because if you have sitting water, when you purify things, it makes the water unclean. right? Anything that uncleanliness touches, which is why you have all the regulations. If you're unclean, if you have leprosy, if you touch someone, if you touched a corpse and then you touch someone else, that person becomes unclean. So it's, it's this idea that everything becomes unclean. And so the water, to stay pure, had to have a flowing source through it, which meant you had cold water, which I'm all for. But they would go down and they would baptize utensils. They would baptize themselves. They would walk into the mikvahot. They would kneel down. They would immerse themselves as part of purification. So that was going on for hundreds or thousands of years. So all those things are a shadow of the things to come, and that's really important to understand. That Jesus' baptism didn't come out of thin air. They weren't like, now we're in the New Testament time, and now we're going to have this thing called baptism. Baptism was nothing new. It was nothing new. Okay, so in Hebrews, they set up the supremacy of Christ as God's Son. We'll start in chapter 1, verse 1. Long ago, at many times and in many ways, God spoke to our fathers by the prophets, but in these last days, he has spoken to us by his Son, whom he appointed the heir of all things, through whom also he created the world. This is important too, and we see this, I think, a really clear case of this with the Samaritan woman at the well. She goes and she tells people in the village, she's like, hey, this guy, I think he's the Messiah. He told me everything that I've ever done. And then John says in John 4, he says, many people believed in Jesus because of her testimony. He's told me everything that he's done. And then the people come and they listen to Jesus, and they say something really interesting. And I know, it took a long time for me to pick up on this, but here's what they say. They said, now we know that he is the Christ, the Messiah. Now we know that he's the Messiah, not because you told us that he said everything I've done, but because we've heard it from him ourselves. We know that he's the Messiah because he said it. And that's really important, and that's exactly what Hebrews is establishing here. In the last days, he's spoken to us by his Son, by Christ, whom he appointed heir of all things, through whom he created the whole world. He is the radiance of the glory of God. Remember how I talked about glory? Every time we see glory in the Bible, there's this blinding light that shows up. Jesus, when he received glory on top of the mountain of the transfiguration, when he was transfigured, there's this blinding brightness when the glory of God shows up. And now he's the radiance, interesting word, right? Makes sense. He's the radiance of the glory of God and the exact imprint of God's nature. And he upholds the universe by the word of his power. After making purification for sins, he sat down at the right hand of the Majesty on high, having become as much superior to angels as the name he has inherited is more excellent than theirs. All right, so Christ makes this purification for sins. Remember, he's writing to a Jewish audience who they're thinking, okay, purification for sins, you baptize your utensils, you baptize yourself, you go through this sacrifice process, you sin many times, you kill many animals, the priest eats many times and gets fat. But now Christ has made this ultimate sacrifice. And so he's setting up the supremacy of Christ. All right, and then skipping over to chapter 3. You have, therefore, my brothers, starting in verse 1. Therefore, holy brothers, you who share in a heavenly calling, consider Jesus, the apostle and high priest of our confession, who was faithful to him who appointed him, just as Moses also was faithful in all God's house. For Jesus has been counted worthy of more glory than Moses, as much more glory as the builder of a house has more honor than the house itself. For every house is built by someone, but the builder of all things is God. Now Moses was faithful in all God's house as a servant to testify to the things that were to be spoken later. But Christ is faithful over God's house as a son, and we are his house. If indeed we hold fast our confidence and our boasting in our hope. All right, so you hear what he's saying. Moses was kind of setting the stage for Jesus. What Moses did was good, but he wasn't the builder. He was faithful. He was a servant to testify to the things that were to be spoken later. But Christ is faithful over God's house, and his house is you. It's us. We are God's house. Then he sets up establishes Christ as the great high priest. Chapter 4, verse 14. Since then we have a great high priest who has passed through the heavens, Jesus, the Son of God. Let us hold fast our confession. For we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, but one who in every respect has been tempted as we are, yet without sin. Let me ask a question. And this one has stumped me for years. And I don't know why. Maybe it never tripped any of you guys up. But why, if we really believe that Jesus is the Son of God, that Jesus, it's impossible for him to sin, right? If he's really the Son of God, he cannot sin. If he's the ultimate high priest, he's the ultimate sacrifice for all people, he can't sin, right? Is that fair to say that's a true statement? Then why was he tempted?
I think he can sin. He's a human, so that's why he's tempted. I mean, I think that.
Is the question more, was it possible for Jesus to sin when he was here? Is that what you're asking?
I don't know. You tell me, Brett. Right? I mean, you're right. Like he's human in nature, but he's also God. Aaron says he could have sinned, but he didn't. But what's interesting is the second he sinned, he fails to be the Son of God because God can't sin. And so it's kind of that circular argument. Well, yeah, I mean, he could, but he couldn't. It's kind of a paradoxical statement because you're right. Like he could have sinned, but if you say he couldn't have sinned, you're also right because the minute he sins, he stops being God. God cannot sin, and so I always looked at that wilderness thing. And by the way, the wilderness thing is fantastic because obviously it's a fulfillment of what happened on Sinai, right? Moses was there, not just Sinai, but also the wilderness wanderings, right? It's a fulfillment of those things. Moses is up on the mountain for how many days? 40 days, right? 40 days, 40 nights. He's up on the mountain. He's receiving the Ten Commandments. God envelops the mountain, which is really cool too, because if you think about this from a scientific standpoint, have you ever seen volcanoes? Like an active volcano, and you see the cloud that envelops the top of that volcano. Do you ever see it? What accompanies it? Almost always. What accompanies it? Thunder and lightning. You get these circle lightnings that surround the top of this peak. That's really cool. And so when I read in the Bible this description of what was happening, I look at videos and pictures of these volcanoes, and I'm like, this is an exact picture of what Moses was experiencing up on top of this mountain. Now, I'm not saying that Moses was sitting underneath ash of an active volcano, but it shows, like, if you want to see a picture of what that might have looked like, it's just this fierce violence and energy, and it shows the power and the might and the holiness of God. And so Jesus goes out and he's wandering like the Israelites wandered out in the desert for 40 years, right? They're out wandering around kind of aimlessly. He's wandering around for 40 days, 40 nights, being tempted. No food, no drink. Kind of mimics the no food, and they complained, right? Then Moses strikes the rock. Like you have these mirrors, and on the one side you see all the sin and all the mistakes and all the people screwing up, and they're banned from entering into the promised land because they whined and they complained, and Moses struck the rock, and God said, you're going to be able to see the promised land, but you will not enter into it. Then you have Christ, who clearly enters into heaven. It's like the polar opposite, not polar opposite, but it's the fulfillment of all these things that people screwed up. And it's so cool when you see it laid out. So anyway, back to the whole temptation thing. This is always interesting to me because a high priest cannot make a sacrifice either if he himself is not pure. And Jesus had to be pure to become the sacrifice. To make the sacrifice, he had to be pure. Yeah, so you had priests, and then you had the high priest who, he was the one who atoned for all the sins of all the people. And so that's where we get the term the scapegoat. The high priest once a year would send a scapegoat out into the wilderness. He would take a goat, and he would place his hands on the goat, and this represented all the sins of all the people. And he would say, all right, you are the scapegoat. You're taking on all the sins of all these people. And they would send it out, and it was like this big figurative thing where the people now for the next year could do their mini sacrifices in anticipation for the next year when they would all have to come together. There was this big, huge ceremony and sacrifices, and then it culminated in the high priest, putting his hands on the scapegoat and saying, "Here are the sins of all of Israel. Go out and get out of here." And so the whole point is, now we don't have to do that. Christ is the scapegoat. He's the high priest. He's the sacrifice. He's the goat, the lamb. And he's also the scapegoat. And that scapegoat now has gone out, and we don't have to repeatedly do this over and over. We don't have to wait till the next year, get rebaptized, and say, okay, now my sins can be covered for the next year. Christ fulfilled all of this.
I think it also emphasizes that the high priest had to make a sacrifice for himself.
That's right.
Before he was allowed to go into the Holy of Holies.
That's exactly right. Mm-hmm. So, the temptation thing. I heard, and it may not be the best description, but to me this finally made sense. And they're like, okay, say you have an engineer who says, think of the metaphor, right? Christ, it's not the best metaphor, I know, but Christ he's the Son of God. In essence, he's God in the flesh. There's a human nature, weak, able to sin, but there's also the God nature. It's impossible to sin. And so you have this engineer, and he says, I'm going to build the strongest. It's not going to be the Kinzu Bridge where a tornado hit it. The Kinzu Bridge up north. Has anybody seen that? It's the great big train bridge that was built in the 1800s. And a tornado came through a few years ago, and half of it just came through the valley, and it took half of this train bridge out. And it's all twisted, and they left it. So you can walk out halfway across this overpass, and it's like hundreds of feet above the ground. And they have a glass floor, and you can look down at all the twisted wreckage hundreds of feet below you. And you look out across the span at where the tornado twisted, and then you can walk down to the bottom. We went last summer, and it's so cool. But that's a bridge that didn't pass the test of time, and it was some French guy who engineered it, and this was touted as one of the great wonders of the world. This was the strongest train trestle that absolutely could not be destroyed, and it was annihilated. So say that you have an engineer And they say, we're going to build the strongest bridge that's known to man. And it can carry a train of any weight, any capacity. You could stack 50 trains on top of each other, and they could park on that train bridge, and it's not going to go anywhere. Well, if you make that claim, how do you back up that claim? Yeah, you have to prove it, right? You can't just say, hey, I'm going to build this thing, and it's going to be indestructible. And then you like cross your fingers, and people are like, okay. Like they test it before they ever put a live train across it. They have to test it. And everything goes through a test. When you engineer things, they put planes, right? Planes are a prime example. You ever see the stress test that they do on the wings? It's the coolest thing. Anybody ever see that? Is anybody as morbid as me? Like, I am fascinated. I'm infatuated with plane accidents. So I watch like all this stuff, and I want to know about the engineering. And so they hook these cables to the tips of the wings, and then they have something that presses down the fuselage. It has downward pressure, and then they pull up on the wings, and it's like millions of pounds of force, and they lift them until they absolutely shatter and just obliterate. And that's how they test the strength and durability of the wings. And that's how engineers can tell you, and you'll hear pilots say, even severe turbulence, where you see the videos, do you guys watch those morbid videos? Am I the only one? Like severe turbulence where people just get like bad injuries, and the carts are flying and hitting the ceiling, people are screaming, and the air masks come down. Even during severe turbulence, planes are completely survivable. Well, how do we know that? Because they've been tested over and over and over. So I think it was vital for us to believe that Christ really is God's Son, God in the flesh. For us to really believe that that's true, that he cannot sin, he had to be tested. He had to be. Otherwise, I honestly think a lot of people wouldn't believe if he hadn't gone through these tests. Testing is important. It's the refinement by fire. For Jesus to be the great high priest, he had to be tested. Okay. Chapter 4, verse 16. Let us then with confidence draw near to the throne of grace, that we may receive mercy and find grace to help in time of need. For every high priest chosen from among men is appointed to act on behalf of men in relation to God, to offer gifts and sacrifices for sins. He can deal gently with the ignorant and wayward, since he himself is beset with weakness. Because of this, he's obligated to offer sacrifice, here it is, we just talked about it, for his own sins, just as he does for those of the people. And no one takes this honor for himself, but only when called by God, just as Aaron was. So also, Christ did not exalt himself to be made high priest, but was appointed by him, who said to him, "You are my son, today I've begotten you." As he says in another place, "You are a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek." Now, who is this Melchizedek guy? It's an interesting statement. Which lineage did priests have to come from? The tribe of who? Levi, right? So you have the Levitical priesthood, and then even more specifically, you have the Aaronic priesthood. Now that's not Somerset County ironic, Aaronic. That's A-A-R-O-N, Aaronic priesthood. The priest had to come from what? What's that? Yeah, right. Yeah. So, well, it's the tribe of Levi. So Aaron and Moses came from the tribe of Levi, one of the sons of Israel. But specifically, the priest had to come through Aaron. Through Aaron's, like you had to be a direct descendant of Aaron to be a priest. So it wasn't just all, like there's the assumption that all Levites were priests or were eligible to be priests, but that's not true. You had to come from the lineage of Aaron himself. You had to be a Levite, but you also had to come from Aaron. So you can think of the song, Alanis Morissette, Isn't That Aaronic? So you have the Levite priest, but then you have Jesus, who doesn't come from the tribe of Levi, does he? Uh-oh. Houston, we've got a problem, right? You've got a high priest now who doesn't come from the tribe of Levi, doesn't come from Aaron. What do we do with that? And so he's establishing this high priesthood that comes through the order of Melchizedek. Now, Melchizedek is mentioned in Genesis chapter 14. I have so many papers stuffed in my Bible, it's ridiculous. If anybody likes to organize and would like to organize my mess, yeah. I don't think there's any amount of time that could straighten up my life. I know. I should. There's like receipts in here. There's all kinds of bizarre stuff. That's why when people hand me stuff, I'm like, don't hand me stuff unless you want it lost. Okay. Genesis chapter 14 and verse 18. We'll start in 17. After his return from the defeat of Kedor-Laomer, I don't know how you pronounce that. It's a strange Hebrew name. And the kings who were with him, the king of Sodom, went out to meet him at the valley of Shaveh, that is, the king's valley. And Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. All right, the Old Testament, right, is a shadow of the things to come. What's this representing? Now, in hindsight, we can see it. Yeah, the Lord's Supper, the Passover. Has the Exodus even happened yet? Not even close. This is Abraham. So you already have a shadow of the things to come. So he brings out the bread and the wine. And then in parentheses, he was a priest of God Most High. First of all, he's not a Hebrew. He's the king of Salem. Secondly, did priests even exist in Israel? No. Right, that's right. Israel didn't even exist. So you look at this and you're like, wait a second, there's this priesthood language, and this guy is priest of God Most High. It's a shadowing of the things that are coming. And so you find these little trails of breadcrumbs all throughout the Bible that are all pointing to Jesus. All of them. All the prophets, all the judges, all the humans, all these people are pointing to Jesus. And I think it's so cool that when Genesis was written thousands of years before Christ came to earth, I don't think that they're writing this saying, all right, we're writing about the Messiah right now. You know? Like, God is inspiring them to write these things, and then you look back and you're like, holy cow. Like, this is absolutely incredible. So Christ comes through this foreshadowing of Melchizedek, who is priest of God Most High. So that's pretty fascinating to me.
Specifically, that there was no record of his beginning or end.
That's right. Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, so Melchizedek, thank you. Yeah, so Melchizedek, there's absolutely no record of his beginning or end. We have no idea. Like, there are very few in the Bible. Enoch is another one. I think so. I believe so. Yeah, from the Chaldeans, which are the Babylonians. I believe so. So, yeah, pretty interesting stuff. There's no beginning, no end. This dude just kind of appears out of nowhere, then there's no mention of him again. And it's interesting too. I got to wrap up, but this is so fascinating to me. There are commentaries that were written by Jewish people that were found among the Dead Sea Scrolls, where they talk about Melchizedek, and they talk about how he was like one of these mysterious people who, some think he was an angel, and he came and went, wasn't really born and didn't really die. He descended to earth. And so there are theories about that that are written. So clearly that was on the mind of Jewish people even before Jesus came to earth. There was this mystery surrounding Melchizedek, and they're like, this is a guy who doesn't really have a beginning and an end. So it's fascinating. Anyway, that's probably a lot deeper than what the kids went.